Thank you for joining the RIETI BBL webinar. My name is Ying Ting. I'm a research fellow and policy advisor of RIETI and an associate professor at Hitotsubashi University. It's a very great pleasure today to moderate this seminar. Firstly, I'd like to extend a warm welcome to Professor Wei Shangjing. Although he is so well known as to need no introduction, as today's moderator, I'm honored to introduce him to you. Dr. Wei Shangjing is NT1 Professor of Chinese Business and Economy and Professor of Finance and Economics at Columbia University's Graduate School of Business and School of International and Public Affairs. He serves as the Director of Chinese Economy Working Group at the Nation Bureau of Economic Research. He holds a PhD in economics from the University of California, Berkeley. He previously held positions at Harvard University, ADB, as the first chief economist, IMF as Assistant Director and Chief of Trade and Investment Division, and the World Bank. He has been a consultant to numerous government organizations, including the U.S. Board of Governors of the Federal Reserve System, United Nations. Professor Wei's research has been published in lots of top academic journals. Many of them are highly influential with a high citation count. Professor Wei also received many economics prizes, including the Sun Yanfang Prize in Economic Science Award, one of China's highest honors in the economic field. Today, Professor Wei will deliver a lecture titled Trade Tensions and the U.S. Soft Power. Well, please welcome Professor Wei to give us the presentation.
Thank you very much, Dr. Yin. Good morning, everyone. It's an honor and privilege for me to be able to share some research with you. My topic is trade frictions and American soft power. I'm very much grateful to RIETI for inviting me and hosting today's event. So we're entering an era of de-risking. De-risking is one of the most important buzzwords in international politics and maybe global economy these days. One of the risks of de-risking is this being turned into larger scale decoupling, deglobalization, dislocation. Today's talk is going to look at a much narrower slice of this picture, and is about the effects of trade frictions on U.S. soft power. More specifically, I'm going to discuss some research findings on how the U.S. trade war against China that was started in March 2018 under President Trump and continued under President Biden today may have affected U.S. soft power as reflected in or proxied by the viewership of U.S. movies and sales of U.S. branded automobiles in China. So here's a picture that describes how dominant U.S. movies are in global economy. So, so this looks at essentially market share of movies from U.S. in global movie sales. You can see worldwide, this is based on a movie database, IMDb database. U.S. movies account for, in dollar amount, something like 70% of global movie sales. It's a tiny bit of decline in recent years, but still way above 60%. As comparison, U.S. military expenditure, U.S. has the world's largest military. Its military expenditure is bigger than the sum of the next 7 or 8 military powers, greater than the sum of the next 7 military powers. In spite of that, U.S. military expenditure is something like 30% of the global military expenditure. US-based or US-origined foreign direct investment is 20% of global foreign direct investment. US GDP is something like 18% of global GDP. US imports as a share of global imports, US exports as a share of global exports are even lower, something like 10% or lower. So relative to those terms, sort of hard military power, hard economic powers, US movie is extremely, extremely dominant in global movie scene. That shouldn't be surprising to anyone in the audience. Everyone can recall, seeing 1 or 2 US movies a year, right? So, but this just numbers very striking to me. If you look at how U.S. movie is dominated in a country that I'm going to focus on for today's talk, you see similar pictures. So on this picture, the top line traces U.S. movie revenue in China relative to all non-Chinese movie revenues in China from 2012 to more recent years, and that's also hovering around 80-some%. So extremely, extremely dominant among foreign movies. So virtually every Chinese can recall seeing 1 or 2 US movies a year at least. So like extremely dominant. Similarly, on the same graph, I compare this to Chinese exports to US as a share of all Chinese exports, or Chinese imports from US as a share of all Chinese imports. These are, on the order of 20-some% or lower. Or US foreign direct investment in China as a share of all foreign investment in China, that's a lower number, 10% or lower. So relative to all of those measures that we are familiar with, US movies are also extremely, extremely dominant in Chinese movie scenes. As a comparison, you look at Japanese movies in China as a share of all foreign movies, that's a much lower number. French movies or Indian movies or movies from virtually any other country as a share of foreign movies, they're at much lower level. So in spite of all the tensions one reads and hears about, US movies are just extremely, extremely, they're popular, so it's partly a market outcome. Whoever makes US movie, they manage to capture audience imagination in some way. That's not unique to China, of course. That's true for many other countries as well. Here's a picture about automobile sales in China. So the table on the right, I just searched this morning from the website. The table on the right lists top 15 best-selling automobile brands last year in China. You see that top 15 list contains many foreign branded products, including Volkswagen, GM, Toyota, Nissan, Honda, and so on. So many foreign brands are selling well in China, including Japanese brands and US brands. In some sense, the automobile sales, given that they are important big-ticket consumer products, could also carry soft powers. Movie perhaps is more direct, but other US branded products is somewhat less direct, but they partially also reflect. Some of the people buy foreign branded products because they like to be associated with international brands. That's the sense in which it has soft power components. So now let me tell you more about the notion of soft power. First, the idea that popularity of US branded products, including creative products, our first commentator, Cho-san, will tell us more about creative products in general. But US movie is a very special case of these creative products, has been recognized by many experts as an element of US soft power. As a soft power, they help to spread US values, US interests, knowledge about US institutions, history, and sympathy and potential buying for US ways of looking at the world. Joseph Nye. My very first paid job was assistant professor at Harvard University's Kennedy School of Government. And one of the former deans of the Kennedy School is renowned political scientist, Professor Joseph Nye, Jr. And among his celebrated work was the notion of soft power, which he defines as ability of a country to attract or co-opt others to get desired outcomes from a U.S. point of view, rather than coercing with threat or inducing with payment. So soft power, like hard power, is the ability to get other people to do things you want, but not through money, not through military power, but through ability to attract, to influence others' thinking. And in his book on soft power, 2 books, he often mentioned U.S. movies is a particular example of soft power. Soft power can potentially extend U.S. hard power in military and economic might, or at least complements the hard power. So that's sort of Joseph Nye's creative concept that he thinks U.S. ability to influence the world goes beyond its share of economy in the world economy, share of its trade in world trade, and very mighty U.S. Navy, Air Force, and military in general. These are all very powerful, but soft power is also important. Influence going through Hollywood is also important. I'm going to make a connection between soft power and trade war. So here's some reminder to us about what trade war was. So the current wave of trade war was launched by President Trump in 2018 against China, but initially also against maybe Japan, some other countries, but eventually reorganized to be concentrated just on China, and escalated by President Trump twice in terms of raising tariff. So the currently U.S. tariff on imports from China has been raised to an extremely high level, to pre-World War II level. So one of the high point in terms of level of tariff in recent U.S. Tariff history was what's called the Smoot-Hawley tariff of 1930s, which some blame was what's responsible partly to global Great Depression. And currently U.S. tariff imports from China has been raised to the Smoot-Hawley level, so extremely high level. The tariff, the Trump tariff, has been justified, certainly was justified by Trump administration and stay on the book, as a penalty for Chinese government's unfair trade policies and practices, theft of U.S. intellectual property rights, and other deviations from international rules and norms. So the high tariffs are very high because they are intended as a punishment for bad things the Chinese government is doing in the trade area, according to President Trump. In theory or conceptually, how the U.S. trade war affects U.S. soft power, including soft power in China, can go either direction, can either improve soft power or reduce soft power, depending on whether citizens in the targeted country regard U.S. Trade war or the rationale behind trade war is righteous action against the unfair policies of their own country, or they are regarded as potentially policies that are inconsistent with the U.S. Image and professed ideals of maintaining rule-based world order. So it can go either way. So an example of going, heightened trade friction by U.S. could improve U.S. soft power is U.S. sanctions on Venezuela in 2014. So after U.S. announced sanctions against Venezuela, when we look at the U.S. movie exports, we find there's an increase in U.S. movie exports to Venezuela. In fact, the share of U.S. movies in all movies shown in Venezuela went up from something like 80% before the U.S. sanction to much more dominant of 98%. So Venezuela was simply just looking at U.S. movies, not movies from elsewhere. So at least in in theory or in principle, it is possible for heightened trade frictions to increase U.S. Soft power. But we don't really have systematic evidence on how the current trade war affects U.S. Soft power in China and other countries. Soft power is, unlike GDP or FDI or exports, tends to be harder to measure. Right? So perhaps viewership of U.S. movies, automobile sales of U.S. brands could be proxies for soft powers. All right. So now let me give you a bit more background about more about U.S. movies. So here I call U.S. movie is possessing double features. It's a play on the word of features. So that there are double features in the sense it is certainly a form of entertainment, but it goes beyond as a form of entertainment. It has been recognized by political scientists and U.S. Government officials at various times that U.S. movies are also an advertisement for U.S. values. For example, in the literature, people call Hollywood is little State Department, meaning at least indirectly it might help to promote the objective of the U.S. State Department. U.S. movies has been called a gigantic reservoir of goodwill towards U.S. by a former U.S. presidential candidate in 1940. U.S. values in U.S. movies are often, but we note, people will note, after all, movies are not produced by government, or largely not produced by government. So U.S. values in U.S. movies could be an incidental outcome of movie directors, script writers, and so on. But when preparing for this research, one of the things I learned, somewhat to my surprise, is that that's not entirely the case. So, for example, U.S. government actually has an active industrial policy for promoting certain type of U.S. movies. For example, any movies involving war themes, often the U.S. Department of Defense has a Hollywood liaison office. They will offer effective subsidy to movie producers if the movies is done in such a way that Department of Defense likes. So if they produce a script or made in a way that tend to spread the value or the image that Department of Defense likes, Department of Defense can offer free or at least very low cost usage of aircraft carriers, helicopters, fighter jets, military bases, sometimes use of soldiers. So as long as the director or script is willing to do movies in certain ways. I also learned that apparently Central Intelligence Agency, CIA, also has a program to encourage movies to be made in certain way, something I did not realize. An example, there are many examples of this. One of the recent example is Zero Dark 30. That's about a movie about I think it's about killing Osama bin Laden. I think one of the blockbuster movie that eventually won both Golden Globe and Oscar winners. That through internet research you will find stories about how the director rewrote the scripts in order to conform with the advice from Department of Defense. In return, they get subsidies in kind from U.S. government. Something I did not know, but that's certainly consistent with the idea that the government is aware that U.S. movies can play a role of U.S. soft power. So let me summarize what our research will do, and then give you some tidbits of details. So one way to check how trade frictions, in particular the trade war that was started by President Trump, might affect how Chinese, the regular people, how they receive U.S. values or U.S. products as reflected in the movies or automobiles, is to explore regional variations across the country, China. So more precisely, when President Trump raised tariff, it does not raise all tariff, but because tariff can be very high, extremely high in some sectors, somewhat less high in other sectors. So there's some variations across sectors. And because different parts of China have different exposure to trading with US. So the same Trump tariff increase can translate into different kind of impact to people in different parts of the countries. So to be concrete, for example, people in Dongguan part of Guangdong, because they may be working in jobs that rely heavily on exports to US. So they are very exposed to an increase in tariff. In contrast, people in Chengdu may be mostly working in sectors that have relatively mild exposure to exports to US. Therefore, the same increase in US tariff will have comparatively smaller impact on the lives of people in Chengdu. So this is an example of variation of Trump tariff increase on Chinese people in different parts of the country. So the point is, even though Trump tariff increase is same increase for any exports, same increase to Chinese exporters, but because different parts of China have different kind of specialization patterns, this translate the Trump tariff increase translates into differential effect on lives of people in different part of the country. So some parts of the country can be very strongly affected. Other parts of the country can be maybe not affected at all, and other parts of the country have been affected in some more moderate ways. So you have these very natural regional variations in exposure to Trump tariff. Using this regional variation, we can ask ourselves the following question: how would people's perception or reception of U.S. products and creative products, U.S. movies, for example, differ in response to Trump tariff? Is it the case, for example, people in regions more exposed to Trump tariff respond more strongly, either more strongly positive or more strongly negatively to Trump tariff or not? Right? So that these are the questions that one can use data to examine. If Trump tariff, on average, make people to remind them that what U.S. doing is right, it's a penalty to their own government's wrongdoing, those who are more exposed to Trump tariff may decide to watch more U.S. movies. Alternatively, if they somehow think the tariffs are not well justified, they may respond to tariff increase by reducing their viewership of U.S. movies. These are all possibilities that we're going to check. We're going to find the data tell us that it goes in one particular way. In particular, regions that are more exposed to Trump tariff increase tend to reduce their viewership of U.S. movies by a very significant amount. Using the concept of elasticities. So one standard deviation of increase in exposure to U.S. tariff translates into 5.6% reduction in U.S. movie viewership, if you happen to know what a standard deviation is. Now, of course, those numbers by themselves may not be enough, because you need to worry about the fact that the exposure to Trump tariff can also translate into reduction in income. If I happen to be working in jobs that relies on exports to U.S., U.S. raising tariff could affect my income, right? So if my income goes down, I may consume less of everything, including U.S. movies. So we want to directly measure the income effect. We find some negative effect of income from U.S. tariff increase, but we want to find the income effect. We want to account for income effect. We want to make sure whatever we say about the viewership of U.S. movies go beyond income effect. So when we do this is to directly account for how changing in income affects changing in movie viewership. And we can also compare viewership of U.S. movies with viewership of movies in general, right? That's one thing that's very important to account for. The other thing that's very important to account for is to account for actions of Chinese government, central government as well as local government. So, for example, one of the things one might imagine is either the central or local government, through propaganda, emphasize how terrible U.S. action may be. Maybe it's the government propaganda that leads people to change U.S. movie viewership, rather than consumers' own choice. So we're going to look into evidence of potential variations in government propaganda. In particular, we ask ourselves, is there any evidence that in regions more exposed to Trump tariff increase, do we see more local government or central government propaganda emphasizing the trade war or not? The simple answer would be, we look into this and we don't really find regional variations supporting the idea that more greater government propaganda in more tariff-exposed regions. Similarly, for income, we're going to account for income effect. We're going to see even accounting for whatever may happen to income and how the change in income may affect movie viewership. Tariff has additional, U.S. tariff increase has additional effect on U.S. movie viewership. So this is the summary on movie viewership. A summary on sales of U.S. branded automobiles. We're going to find similar data patterns. In particular, exposure to U.S. tariffs seems to reduce Chinese consumers' appetite for U.S. branded cars. And importantly, this effect goes beyond imports of U.S. cars, because the U.S. branded automobiles come in two varieties. Some of the cars are imported from U.S. Some of the U.S. branded cars are made in China, often through joint venture companies. So the imported cars are affected by Chinese increase in tariff from U.S. So some of the reduction in sales of U.S. Cars could be simply because they become more expensive, high U.S. tariff. But we're going to show that we find that the reduction in U.S. sales also applies to locally made U.S. branded cars. So these U.S. branded cars face no change in cost because they are not imported from U.S. So even without changing cost, data tells us that people in more tariff-exposed regions tend to buy fewer U.S. cars after the Trump tariff increase. So importantly, we find some very interesting differences across in people's responses based on their income level and other features. So what's called heterogeneity. Heterogeneity is a bit of a boring term. So what I'm saying here is that we also see that different consumer groups appear to respond to the same tariff increase differently. So to be more precise, under U.S. Movie viewership, we can classify Chinese movie theaters into those that charge relatively higher ticket price versus those that charge relatively lower ticket price. And the difference in ticket prices essentially reflects amenities, quality of the movie theaters. Some movie theaters have fancy chairs, fancy tables, bigger screens, high quality screens, so these charge higher prices. Others, theaters charge lower prices. This difference in prices might correspond to different segments of the market. Presumably, relatively wealthy, more affluent moviegoers go to fancier theaters. Regular people, other people go to less fancy movie theaters. All of them show U.S. movies. All of them show Japanese movies. All of them show Chinese movies. What we find is that the reduction in U.S. movie viewership tends to be more pronounced in lower-priced theaters, whereas people go to fancier theaters appear to display smaller aversion to U.S. movies. That suggests somehow if there's a change in reception of U.S. values, there's difference between relatively more affluent peoples versus less affluent peoples. Cars, the same thing. We can sort car models based on unit prices. Manufacturers suggested retail prices. Some cars are very expensive, some cars are less expensive. Interestingly, US branded cars occupies a very broad range of price categories. There are some very, very expensive US cars that compete with other relatively luxury products, Lexus and or similar. There are also more medium-priced US cars and low-priced US cars. And we find similar patterns. That is, those consumers that buy relatively less expensive US cars display stronger aversion to US brands once they go into trade wars. Once trade war happens, people who buy relatively less expensive US cars show stronger aversions, whereas people buy the very expensive US cars show no aversion. They don't seem to respond to the trade war at all. That kind of heterogeneity, that is different reactions to the same trade war from people of different income level and maybe other features, I think is also noteworthy. Colleges, online search for US colleges that we see on balance, there's a reduction. Once the trade war started, there's a reduction in search for US colleges in regions that are more exposed to US tariff. Here, I'll note that my University of Tokyo friends told me that they see more application for Japanese campus colleges and graduate schools from Chinese applicants. So in a way, there's a divergence. So to the extent many families still want to have their children study abroad, there's a reduced appetite for US colleges. So Columbia University may be taking a loss. In contrast, other foreign colleges or colleges in other countries might see an increase. So University of Tokyo, maybe Hitotsubashi, and so on might see correspondingly an increase in application from Chinese students. I should note that college attendance by Chinese students is one way for country, for Japan and US to export stuff to China. It's a service exports, right? So it is exports as well. All right, so in the remaining 10 minutes, let me give you a bit more details. First, recall the trade war started in March 2018 by President Trump. Formally, President Trump asked United States Trade Representative, it would have been called the Ministry of Industry, USTR equivalent in Japan, we call it Ministry of Industry and Trade and Commerce, Trade something, right? So, or in other countries we call Ministry of Trade. President Trump asked the U.S. Trade Ministry equivalent to apply additional tariff of $50 to $60 billion on imports from China, citing Section 301 of the U.S. Trade Act of 1974. This increase was announced in March and went into effect in July and August. In subsequent months and years, President Trump raised tariff 2 more times, additional $200 billion, many Chinese goods, additional $272 billion in 2018, 2019, respectively. China retaliated with its own tariff increase on $185 billion worth of U.S. products. The trade war essentially sort of stopped, not really stopped. The escalation of tariff stopped through January 2020 agreement, so-called Phase 1 agreement between U.S. and China. It didn't reverse the tariff. It simply say no more increase. Okay, so all the tariffs that were put in place remain in place, and that's still true today. So formally, President Biden has kept all the President Trump's tariff. Now, other U.S. actions justified under international law. That's one of the big ones. So we said that conceptually, how people in the recipient countries of the trade tension view action by the other country might partly depend on, in their mind, whether this is the right thing to do or the wrong thing to do. So in their context, it might be useful to look at how international organizations view U.S. actions. So China brought a case against the U.S. to World Trade Organizations. After a year and a half, WTO ruled through a WTO panel consisting of countries other than U.S. Or China. And WTO ruling was that U.S. Tariff increase were illegal, or more precisely using WTO legal language, U.S. tariffs are inconsistent with U.S. obligations under WTO Articles 1 and 2. So WTO Article 1 says U.S. tariff on imports from any country should be the same as its tariff on same good from any other countries. That's called MFN principle. That's the WTO member countries' obligation under Article number 1. And then Article number 2, violation of Article number 2 means violation of a tariff commitment, that once a country announced a tariff schedule, it cannot unilaterally raise committed tariff. So that's a lawyer's fancy way to say U.S. action in the judgment of WTO is illegal under international trade law. So, so because of this, one might imagine, so this U.S. Tariff increase qualitatively could be different from U.S. sanctions on Venezuela in 2014 or U.S. sanctions on Russia in 2022, neither of which has been ruled by WTO as illegal. More background on the movies in maybe I skipped this. So let me say in words. So the way China import foreign movies is to put foreign movies into two categories: blockbuster movies and other, more artistic, smaller movies. On blockbuster movies, China had a quota on foreign movies through its WTO accession negotiation. There are 34 or so movies. The one thing we verify in the data is that there's no reduction in quotas. So essentially, data shows that China, after the Trump trade war, China was importing essentially as many foreign movies as before. There was no reduction so the movie imports can be controlled by Chinese government because all the movie imports were done by two state-owned firms. So, but there's no reduction in movie imports of number of foreign movies. The showing of the movies by theaters is essentially done by private sectors. 98.8% of movie theaters in China are privately owned. They are not owned by they are not state-owned. So overwhelming majority of the theaters, they are not state-owned. And what movies to show are decisioned by the theaters based on their best guesses of which movie can sell. We also verified that the quality of U.S. movies imported during that time, there's no reduction there as well. Maybe the key detail, I show a few more graphs. One is maybe the graph on the right is useful in our context. So even though Trump announced tariff increase on imports from China, so different product will experience different tariff increase, right? So for same product, there will be a particular tariff increase. We can translate the Trump tariff increase into different regional exposures, because I told you, Guangdong, Chengdu, or other places have different specialization patterns. So therefore, they have this different exposure to Trump tariff. And the picture on the right, using different color scheme to show that some darker regions are regions they are strongly affected by tariff increase because the kind of things they produce, because the kind of jobs people there have. Lighter colors are regions with comparatively smaller exposure to Trump tariffs. Again, because the kind of things, kind of jobs that people have. Okay, so there are a lot of variations. And we do statistical analysis, which I probably will not have time to go into econometrics. Some of you probably don't care that much about how we do the econometrics, but I'm going to summarize the result in a graph. So on this graph, what we do is we look at relationship between change in local movie viewership from, say, 2019, so the time after Trump has raised tariff, relative to 2016, the year of 2017, I think, the year before Trump tariff increase. And different regions have different exposure to this. So the vertical axis tells about changing movie viewership, region by region or city by cities. The horizontal axis gives us a change in exposure to Trump tariff increase. So any given dot is like a collection of cities. So for example, so the dots on the right relative to dots on the left are regions that are more exposed to Trump tariff. So Trump tariff have bigger impact on the region on the right than the region on the left. On the vertical axis, the dots on the top are places where there's relatively small change or no change in viewership of U.S. movies. And dots on the lower part are regions with bigger drop in U.S. movie viewership. So what you see on the picture, so I have two ways to do this. One is using city as observation. The other is individual theaters. Our movie data can go all the way to theater and individual movies. But either way, you'll find that on balance, these two variables are negatively associated. What does that mean? That means on balance, regions that have experienced greater increase in Trump tariff tends to show much bigger reduction in local viewership of U.S. movies. And then we check, is this true for movies from Japan, movies from India, movies from other countries? We find no. So this negative effect is concentrated on local viewership of U.S. movies. There's no corresponding change in viewership of Japanese movie, Indian movies, or other foreign movies. There is an increase in local viewership of Chinese movies. When people decide to watch fewer U.S. movies, they don't see fewer movies. They switch to see more Chinese movies. So tariff exposure seems to have that kind of effect. Automobiles. Maybe the best way to summarize the result is to look at this picture, where the picture on the lower right shows that regions more exposed to Trump tariff increase show bigger reduction in local purchase of U.S. automobile cars. In contrast, the lower left shows there's no such correspondence between local sales of Japanese cars versus local exposure to Trump tariff. Interestingly, the top up left is sales of Chinese automobiles. There's also no obvious connection between. So more exposure to Trump tariff does not lead to more sales of Chinese automobiles either. But the upper right graph shows German cars. And we actually see that more tariff-exposed regions that experience greater Trump tariff increase, actually people buy more German-branded cars. So when people decide to buy fewer U.S. cars, they go to buy more German cars. That's kind of interesting. That I would not have been able to guess without looking at the data. Maybe the last thing I want to say is when you decompose this one. When you decompose cars by price categories, what you find, I'm not doing right. What you find is that when you here I sort all the automobiles into cheapest category, that's first quartile, second cheapest category, that's the second quartile, and somewhat more expensive category, third quartile, and very pricey luxury cars, 4 categories. What you'll find is that in the lower price categories of cars, people seem to react to Trump tariff. In particular, regions with more greater exposure to Trump tariff choose to buy fewer U.S. branded cars, but more German branded cars. But in the luxury categories, you see no significant effect. Essentially, those who want to buy expensive U.S. cars continue to buy expensive U.S. cars. Consistent with the movie theater picture, that is, different segments of society seems to respond very differently. That's kind of interesting as well. So I'm going to skip other results. We have some results about survey of people's trust, and there's some evidence that shows that people's self-reported trust in Americans tend to decline in more tariff-exposed regions once the tariff was started as well. So let me go to the summary picture. So to summarize deglobalization or de-risk talk have multiple implications for global economy and global politics. Here I'm talking about a very narrow slice. Impact on U.S. soft power is reflected in data on U.S. movie viewership and sales of U.S. automobiles, where we find that certainly an unintended consequence, perhaps, of trade tension appear to reduce the Chinese appetite for U.S. movies and U.S. cars and maybe U.S. colleges. And this go beyond income effect and go beyond government propaganda effect. So let me stop here. Thank you very much. I very much look forward to our commentators' discussion.
Thank you very much for the impressive speech, Professor Wei.